Yeah, it's a great question. So the background of the question, behind the question, is the fact that we have stories of other people besides Jesus who are portrayed as miracle working sons of God, who often are born because of some miracle, some supernatural event, who are Wunderkind, children who are like religious superstars, and who grow up and then go on itinerant preaching ministries and can heal the sick and cast out demons and raise the dead. And at the end of their life, they ascend to heaven. So, sounds like Jesus. So, one of the better known people in recent times has been this figure, Apollonius of Tyana. Apollonius was not a contemporary of Jesus. He lived at the end of the first century instead of the beginning of the first century. But he also had a miraculous birth where a god made a woman pregnant and he was born, who was a religious genius as a child, who, when he grew up, went on a preaching ministry, teaching people that they shouldn't be concerned about the material things of life. They should be concerned about the spiritual realm, who could heal the sick and make the weather do what they wanted it to do, and so on, and raise the dead. And at the end of his life, he was brought up on charges before the Roman authorities, and he ascended to heaven, where he still is. And so that's Apollonius of Tyana. Now, when you tell it in those general terms, it sounds just like Jesus. If you actually read the stories, it's not just like Jesus. It's very different from Jesus in a lot of ways, lots of ways. For one thing, this guy is a neo-Pythagorean philosopher. He's not a Jew, right. And so there are lots of differences. And the mother's actually not a virgin. It's just God gets her pregnant, but she's not a virgin. So there are lots of differences, but there are lots of similarities. And so the question is, why do you have these stories? And it's, as I said, it's not just Apollonius and Jesus. I mean, you have people like this. And so I think the reason is because in the ancient world, if you're talking about somebody that you think is a superhuman, like he's human, but he's not like the rest of us. Right. There are certain kinds of stories you tell about someone like that. And these are the kinds of stories about their miraculous birth, their miraculous life, their miraculous afterlife. And so these are the things you say. And one of the things you say is that this person has become a divine being. And in the ancient world, the way you become a divine being is by going up to live in the divine realm. And so you have these stories of ascensions up to heaven. It's tricky because Apollonius lived after Jesus, but the accounts we have were written after the Gospels. So, like, you might think, you're not sure who's borrowing from whom here, so it doesn't look like the Gospels are borrowing from Apollonius, but I'm not sure that the biographer of Apollonius is borrowing from him either. I think these are just stories that you find in the ancient world, and these two people are two of them.
So technically, it was in the milieu, so to speak, in the air. There was a common practice for things like this. Awesome. Next question, same donor. He asked if you could briefly speak about the writings of Lucian of Samosata. And what I like about him is he's a second Socratic. So this is a guy who I guess we'd love him today, especially with the religious freedom we have. But he's arguing and writing funny, humorous stuff about superstitious people. And can you comment on that and just give us elaborate on how this character was in the ancient world and how he affected Christians?
So Lucian of Samosata was he's a skeptic and he's a satirist. So he writes satires. So if you've ever read Voltaire, like the French satirist Candide, who makes fun of religion by having religious people do stupid things, Lucian of Samosata does that, and not just with religion, but also with philosophy. So we have a lot of his works, and some of them are very amusing, and they poke fun at people, including religious figures, including one figure who his name is Peregrinus. This figure is Peregrinus, and he is a cynic philosopher who claims that nothing in this life really matters. The material world doesn't matter. Pleasure doesn't matter. The point is to escape this world and not to be bound by material wealth or material pleasure or anything. And he proves that he's really committed to his message by committing suicide, by throwing himself on a pyre built for the purpose at one of the Olympic Games in the 2nd century. And Lucian observes this whole thing and thinks the guy's a real shyster, even though he's killed himself to do this. But it turns out in Lucian's account of him, he became a Christian for a while. And he duped the Christians into thinking that he was like the second Jesus or something. And so you get that. And then you get other people who are shysters who do magic tricks that are sleights of hand and convince people that they're miracle workers and so on. So Lucian's making fun of all that because he's skeptical about everything like that. He's a terrific source for understanding early Christianity and for understanding some of the New Testament. But he's also just really fun to read. So people who are interested in this kind of thing, Lucian of Samosata, it's great reading.
Thank you, Dr. Ehrman. This is an interesting question. Do you think Morton Smith forged the secret gospel of Mark?
Okay, so this would take 2 hours to answer.
We got like 2 minutes.
Yeah, well, see, I don't know what your listeners would know about the secret gospel. So I'll do it in 2 minutes. So Morton Smith was a brilliant scholar who taught at Columbia University, one of the most brilliant scholars of early Christianity in modern times. During the Second World War, as a young man, he was isolated in Israel. He was there checking out the archaeology and such, and got stuck there during the war, couldn't get out because of the war. And he spent some time in a monastery called Marsaba Monastery outside of Jerusalem, about 12 miles out of Jerusalem. He realized they have this really great library there, but there are no books the books are in there, but there's no catalog of the books. Years later, he went back. He had a research lead from Columbia, and he went back to catalog their books just so they'd know what's in there, because there's old manuscripts and books. And he's going through a book, a particular book written in the 17th century that's the writing of one of the church fathers. It has some blank pages at the back. And inside the blank pages is a handwritten 4 pages of handwriting that looks like it's written sometime in the 18th century. He can judge he's a Greek scholar, and he thinks it's an 18th century hand. He doesn't have time to do it because he's trying to catalog all these books during his leave. So he just takes photographs of it. When he goes back after his leave and he looks at these photographs, he realizes this claims to be a letter written by a famous church father, Clement of Alexandria, who lived around the year 200, who claims that he knew of a different edition of the Gospel of Mark, a secret Gospel of Mark that was kept secret. And this secret Gospel of Mark, among other things, has an episode in which a young man comes to Jesus during his ministry wearing nothing but a linen cloth over his nakedness. And Jesus baptizes him and spends the night with him, teaching him the mysteries of the kingdom of God.
They're teaching the mysteries, all right.
Smith thinks there's more than some kind of spiritual mysteries going on here, and that it's a homoerotic scene. And so he wrote 2 books about it. One, a very scholarly book that's very, very impressive, on Clement of Alexandria and the Secret Gospel of Mark. And the other is a popular book I think it's just called The Secret Gospel of Mark. Scholars verified that these photographs are authentic. They verified that the handwriting is, in fact, from the 18th century. They verified that the style of the letter looks like it is a copy of Clement of Alexandria's writings, because it's very much like Clement's writings. And the quotations from the Secret Mark sound a lot like our Gospel of Mark. And there are a number of people who think that Morton Smith forged it.
Right.
And so the question is, what do I think? I tend to think he forged it. Okay. But it's a minority opinion within scholarship. I think the majority of scholars think that it's authentic.
Well,
but I think he forged it. I think I'm not definite about it. Like, I'm not going to, it's not going to bet my house on it, but that's my guess.
Thank you,
based on a long study of it.
I appreciate it. What was the growth rate of Christianity during its earliest decades? I know you've written on this extensively, but if you don't mind, just give a minute even explaining that. And we'll get into how many converts you think defected from the movement once the promises made by Jesus and Paul regarding the Messiah's return failed. But first, let's talk about the growth rate real quick, and then I have something interesting I want to poke in on that next one.
So in my book on Triumph of Christianity, I try to estimate the growth rate of Christianity if it started out, as the New Testament says, that right after Jesus' death, there were 11 male disciples following him, and there was a handful of women with them in Jerusalem. So there are about 20 people to start. And I think that's probably right, who first believed in the resurrection. By the year 300, there are probably 2 or 3 million Christians.
Wow.
And so people used to say, well, it must be a miracle. How do you get from 20 people to 3 million? It's a miracle. Or people say there must have been like these massive evangelistic rallies where like Billy Graham is down there and, 5,000 convert on one day. How else are you going to get there? A sociologist of religion named Rodney Stark wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity. And sociologists really know how to crunch demographics, numbers. And so he crunched the numbers and said, you don't need a miracle and you don't need massive conversions. What you need is a steady growth rate. And he estimated that if you grow at a rate of about 40% a decade, you'd get there. So in my book on Triumph of Christianity, I discuss Stark's work and I show why there are problems with his numbers. And I recrunch the numbers, and it's not significantly different. The growth rate over time would be about 35% growth rate. And what happens is it's an exponential curve. It's like if you invest money, you're making 7%, and every year you're not making much. You're saving $7 for every $100. But if the $100 is $1 million, you're making money hand over fist at the same rate, right? So the money goes way up, and that's how it is with population growth. So the entire period is about 35%, but it has to be much slower at the end, and it has to be much faster at the beginning. Because if it's only 35% a decade, then after 10 years, those 20 people have become 27 people. There's clearly more than 27 Christians in the world, And so when Paul writes a letter to the Corinth in the 50s, there are more than 40 Christians in there, but 40 Christians in the Church of Corinth. And so it's much faster at the beginning and much slower at the end in order to make it work. What is the rate? I don't know.
It's a guess.
A lot more.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. And this is a technical question, I guess. I don't want to spend too much time because we've got some interesting apologist stuff we will get to, but I want to spend time on the donors' questions. And this one personally has my interest. How many converts do you think defected from the movement once the promises made by Jesus and Paul regarding the Messiah's return failed? And because this is important to ask, and you do this you lecture this all the time and say in your college courses, you ask people to show the difference between Paul's teachings and Jesus' teachings and stuff. So the real question comes down to, there's obviously a failed apocalyptic promise of some sort. What was Jesus's promise? And then Paul has a Messiah that's resurrected and has a returning Jesus. I very much doubt Jesus is on land going, all right, guys, I'm going to die and actually come back. So what promises did Jesus or the original movement, in your best educated guess, would be on what he's saying, and then Paul's, and how many people do you think defected when no return and no actual parousia, if you will, occurred?
So I think Jesus definitely did predict that a cosmic judge that he called the Son of Man was going to come back while his disciples were still alive. So within his generation. Paul probably converted 3 or 4 years after Jesus' death, and he expected Jesus to come back within his generation. He thought he would be alive. 1 Thessalonians 4, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul seems to think he's going to be alive when Jesus returns. Doesn't happen. So there's been some very interesting studies about what happens when you've got a religious group or some other kind of group that has a very firm expectation of something that is going to happen that doesn't happen. And if your listeners want to read something really cool about it, it's called "When Prophecy Fails" by Leon Festinger. Have you read it?
I have it. I'm halfway through it right now. Oh,
fantastic!
Gosh.
Great. So it's about UFO cult, as you know, who are expecting, the Venetians or the Martians or somebody to come on this particular date to take them out of the world, and the end doesn't come. And this author, who's a social psychologist, has infiltrated the group to figure out what are they going to do. You would think what they do is they give up and say, "Oh, we're wrong about that." No, some did, but the other thing that happened that's more striking is that the group became more evangelistic. They reset the date and try to get more converts. And Festinger has a psychological explanation for it. It has to do with a phenomenon that he named cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when you've got a belief that can be confirmed, that is confirmed. So there's dissonance between what you know is going to happen and what you know did happen. You thought you knew was going to happen. What you do know did happen. There's a dissonance there. What happens? If you get more people to agree with you on this belief, it eases your feeling bad that it didn't happen. It makes you think, "Oh, I was right. I just got the date wrong." And so you go out and get more evangelistic. Christians appear to have gone out and gotten more evangelistic.
That makes sense.
So some people certainly would have dropped from the movement, but we don't have any numbers. We don't have numbers for defections at all throughout Christian history. So we don't know. We just don't know.